4:15 in the morning. The Persian Gulf, 60 miles south of the Iranian coastline. USS Kearsarge, a Wasp-class amphibious assault ship designated LHD-3, was steaming at 12 knots when the first electronic warning shrieked through the Combat Information Center. The ship was not on a routine patrol. It was the lead vessel of an amphibious-ready group positioned to monitor escalating tensions near the Strait of Hormuz, carrying over 2,000 sailors and Marines. Something had just flickered on the long-range ANSPS-48 radar, a low-profile contact breaking cover from the jagged shadow of Geshem Island. The question for the bridge crew was no longer if a provocation would occur, but whether the ship's defensive systems could react in the 11 seconds remaining before impact. The humid Gulf air was heavy with salt, and the faint, metallic scent of industrial exhaust from the distant coast. Below the flight deck, the ship hummed with the steady vibration of its steam turbines, a rhythm that had remained unchanged for the last 4 hours of the morning watch. That rhythm was shattered by the high-pitched wail of the incoming missile alarm. On the Iranian coast, a mobile land-based battery had launched 2 SAT-02 anti-ship cruise missiles. These weapons, powered by turbojet engines and guided by active radar seekers, skimmed only 5 meters above the whitecaps of the Persian Gulf, at a speed of 970 kilometers per hour. To the radar operators aboard the USS Kearsarge, the missiles appeared as 2 tiny, lethal blips moving with terrifying purpose against the background clutter of the sea. At coordinates 26 degrees 40 minutes north, 55 degrees 20 minutes east, the tactical action officer shouted the order for birds away, but the engagement window had already closed. The ship's close-in weapon system, the Mark 15 Phalanx, erupted into life on the starboard side. The 20mm rotary cannon fired, at a rate of 4,500 rounds per minute, sending a stream of tungsten armor-piercing bullets into the darkness. The tracer fire carved a bright line across the night sky, reaching out to find the incoming threats. The first SAT-02 missile was shredded by the wall of lead just 300 meters from the hull. It disintegrated in a spectacular spray of burning fuel and twisted aluminum that hissed as it tumbled into the water. However, the second missile, shielded by the debris of its partner, corrected its flight path in a final, terminal maneuver. It punched through the concentrated fire of the Phalanx system and slammed into the starboard side of the USS Kearsarge, just above the waterline at frame 112. The impact was not a singular sound, but a sequence of violent physical events. First came the screech of the missile's hardened nose cone tearing through the thin steel plating of the hull. This was followed instantly by the detonation of the 165-kilogram high-explosive warhead. The blast occurred deep within the ship's interior, specifically inside the primary equipment stowage area and adjacent to the lower vehicle decks. The force of the explosion sent a massive shockwave through the spine of the 84,000-ton ship. On the bridge, officers were thrown from their feet as the deck bucked upward. In the engine rooms, steam lines ruptured under the sudden stress, filling the compartments with white, blinding heat. The initial report from the Damage Control Center indicated a breach measuring 5 meters in diameter. Thousands of gallons of seawater began to pour into the lower decks, driven by the pressure of the ship's own forward momentum. Inside the darkened hallways of the ship, the smell of burnt explosive filler and vaporized hydraulic fluid became thick and suffocating. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting a dim, red glow over the chaos. Damage control teams, trained for years for this exact moment, began to scramble toward the impact zone, dragging heavy hoses and oxygen canisters through knee-deep water that was already slick with spilled diesel. The USS Kearsarge began to list almost immediately. It was a slow, sickening tilt of 3 degrees to the starboard side. On the flight deck, an MH-60 Sierra helicopter that had been chained down shifted violently, its rotors straining against the tie-down points. The ship's commanding officer gripped the edge of the chart table, his jaw set as he looked at the inclinometer. The list was increasing. The professional corps of the United States Navy was now in a race against gravity and the sea. Every sailor on board knew the stakes. The CAT-02 had found a critical weakness, striking near the center of the ship's buoyancy. If the flooding could not be contained within the next 30 minutes, the primary bulkheads would fail under the weight of the incoming ocean. The first impact had been a success for the Iranian battery, but the battle to save the ship had only just begun. The breach at frame 112 was catastrophic, located precisely where the heavy armor of the hull transitioned into the more flexible plating of the lower vehicle stowage area. Inside the cavernous well deck of the USS Kearsarge, the physical reality of the strike was immediate and overwhelming. This space, designed to hold the landing craft and heavy armor of the Marine Expeditionary Unit, became a wind tunnel of fire and pressure. The moment the CAT-02 warhead detonated, the explosion had occurred just feet away from a row of 7-ton trucks and 2 M1A2 Abrams tanks that were lashed to the deck. The blast wave, moving at several thousand meters per second, stripped the paint from the bulkheads and turned every unsecured piece of equipment into a lethal projectile. The thick steel chains holding the vehicle snapped with the sound of rifle shots, sending thousands of pounds of unsecured iron sliding across the deck. As the ship groaned and began its initial tilt to the starboard side, the cold, dark water of the Persian Gulf poured through the jagged 5-meter opening with a terrifying roar, entering at a calculated rate of over 15,000 gallons per minute. The pressure was so immense that it shattered the interior lighting fixtures, leaving the compartment in a disorienting strobe of emergency red lights and the white flashes of electrical shorts. The air was a suffocating mixture of salt spray, vaporized hydraulic fluid, and the acrid, chemical stink of burnt explosive filler. At the center of this chaos were the men of the 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, who had been conducting a pre-dawn equipment check. For the 12 personnel caught in the immediate vicinity of the blast, there was no time to react. The force of the explosion had been directed inward and upward, collapsing the overhead cable runs and sending blast. Hundreds of pounds of copper and steel crashing down onto the deck. 4 Marines were killed instantly by the primary blast, while another 6 were severely injured by flying debris and the sudden influx of high-pressure water. Despite the carnage, the professional discipline of the United States Navy and Marine Corps team remained intact. Within 3 minutes of the impact, the first damage control party from Repair Locker 5 had reached the edge of the well deck. They were led by Chief Petty Officer Robert Miller, a 20-year veteran who had seen combat in 3 different theaters. Under the flickering red lights, Miller's team did not hesitate. They were weighed down by 40 pounds of firefighting gear and oxygen canisters, their boots splashing through water that was already 2 feet deep and rising fast. The immediate objective was the closure of the primary watertight doors at frame 115 to prevent the flooding from reaching the ship's vital engineering spaces. The heavy steel doors, operated by manual hydraulic pumps, required 4 men to move against the pressure of the shifting deck. The sound of the ship was a constant, low-frequency groan, the sound of 84,000 tons of steel protesting the weight of the ocean now entering its gut. Get the Pone 100. Pumps online! Miller shouted over the roar of the incoming water and the scream of the ship's alarms. The portable kerosene-powered pumps were the last line of defense against a sinking ship. As the sailors wrestled the heavy suction hoses into the rising water, the list of the USS Kearsarge increased from 3 degrees to 7 degrees. On the vehicle deck, the water was now waist-deep, a churning, oily mess that dragged at the legs of the damaged control teams. The situation was exacerbated by a Class Bravo fire that had erupted in a nearby electrical distribution room. Fed by ruptured oil lines, the fire produced a thick, black smoke that filled the passageways, reducing visibility to less than 6 inches even with powerful flashlights. The heat was intense enough to blister the paint on the opposite side of the bulkheads, creating a dual-threat environment where the crew had to fight the fire and the flood simultaneously. Every second mattered. If the flooding reached the main switchboard room, the USS Kearsarge would lose all electrical power, silencing the pumps and disabling the defensive systems that were still tracking secondary threats in the air. The Marines of the 2nd Battalion began a desperate relay, carrying their wounded brothers up the narrow, steep ladders to the medical triage area on the hangar deck. Even as the ship continued its slow, heavy roll to the right, the cold Gulf water, now reaching the level of the primary power cables, began to hiss and pop as the ship's heart struggled to keep the lights on. The deck beneath Miller's feet was no longer a stable platform. It was a sliding, wet incline that threatened to dump his entire team into the dark water filling the well deck. The battle for the interior of the ship was a brutal, physical grind against the elements, a test of will between the sailors of the United States Navy and the crushing weight of the Persian Gulf. 5:15 in the morning. 3 miles to the east of the burning amphibious ship, the destroyer USS Mason was already pivoting to intercept a second wave of Iranian missiles. The ship, a Flight 2A Arleigh Burke-class destroyer designated DDG-87, had been at General Quarters since the first flash was detected on the horizon. While the crew of the USS Kearsarge fought the rising water, the USS Mason assumed the role of the primary air defense commander for the remaining vessels in the strike group. The atmosphere inside the destroyer's Combat Information Center was a controlled hum of electronics and low-voice status reports, illuminated by the blue and green glow of the AN/SPY-6 radar consoles. Every sailor in the room knew that if the Mason failed to hold the line, the crippled Kearsarge would be a stationary target for the next 10 minutes. The radar screen suddenly blossomed with 4 new high-speed contacts, designated as vampires by the automated Aegis weapon system. These were additional Kate-02 cruise missiles, launched from a second hidden battery near the coastal town of Jask. They were approaching from the northeast at a combined speed of nearly 2,000 kilometers per hour. The air in the combat center was filtered and cool, but it carried the sharp ozone smell of high-voltage electronics and the faint scent of coffee from the morning watch. Track 501, 502, 503, and 504 confirmed, the air warfare officer reported, his voice steady despite the adrenaline. Birds away from the forward deck. On the forward vertical launch system, the armored hatches of the Mark 41 cells snapped open. 4 evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, designated RIM-162, shrieked into the dawn sky in 3-second intervals. Each missile was a white streak of fire that illuminated the gray, choppy waters of the Gulf, leaving behind a thick cloud of white chemical propellant that drifted across the destroyer's bridge. The missiles climbed steeply before pitching over, their active radar seekers locking onto the incoming Iranian threats at a range of 15 kilometers. The defensive engagement took place at coordinates 26 degrees 45 minutes north, 55 degrees 28 minutes east. From the deck of the USS Mason, the sailors could see the horizon ignite as the first evolved Sea Sparrow intercepted its target. A bright orange fireball expanded against the dark purple sky, followed moments later by the muffled thud of the explosion rolling across the water. 2 more intercepts followed in rapid succession, creating a graveyard of burning debris that fell into the sea 3 miles from the strike group. However, the 4th Iranian missile executed a pre-programmed high-G barrel roll, causing the intercepting Sea Sparrow to pass harmlessly through its wake. The threat was now less than 5 miles from the USS Mason, and its target was the vulnerable listing hull of the USS Kearsarge. The destroyer's commanding officer did not hesitate, ordering the ship to increase speed to 30 knots to bring the aft close-in weapon system to bear. The vibration of the 4 gas turbine engines reached a crescendo, the hull of the USS Mason cutting through the 2-meter swells with a violent, rhythmic spray of salt water that washed over the forward 5-inch gun mount. The ship leaned hard into its turn, the deck plates groaning as the destroyer repositioned itself as a physical shield between the incoming missile and the wounded amphibious ship. Engaging with 5-inch battery and aft phalanx, the tactical action officer shouted. The 5-inch Mark 45 naval gun fired 3 rounds of proximity-fused ammunition. Each shell sent a shockwave through the ship that rattled the windows of the bridge and filled the air with the bitter, sulfurous smell of burnt gunpowder. The shells detonated in the path of the CAT-02, creating a wall of jagged steel fragments. The Iranian missile, battered by the concussive force of the shells, began to wobble in flight, its altitude dropping to just 3 meters above the water. Finally, the aft 20mm phalanx close-in weapon system opened fire. The sound was like a giant zipper being torn open, a continuous roar of fire that sent a stream of 3,000 tungsten rounds into the path of the dying missile. The CAT-02 skipped off the surface of a wave, its engine failing, and finally tumbled into the sea less than 800 meters from the Kearsarge's stern. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the radar operators on the USS Mason remained glued to their screens. The Iranian coastal batteries were still active, and the electronic intelligence gathered by an overhead E-2, Charlie Hawkeye, suggested that more launchers were being moved into position. The Aegis shield had held for now, but the destroyer was nearly out of short-range interceptors, and the USS Kearsarge was still sinking into the dark waters of the Gulf. 5:45 in the morning. Deep within the starboard side of the USS Kearsarge, the battle shifted from a struggle against the sea to a desperate war against a blowtorch. The missile impact had not only breached the hull, but had severed the primary supply lines for JP-5 aviation fuel that ran from the storage tanks to the flight deck. Hundreds of gallons of high-pressure volatile liquid were now spraying into the damaged compartments of the lower vehicle deck. The heat from the initial explosion, which had reached temperatures exceeding 900 degrees, acted as a pilot light. A Class Bravo fire erupted with a sound like a low-frequency roar, a wall of orange flame that instantly consumed the oxygen in the adjacent passageways and turned the steel bulkheads into glowing, radiant heaters. The environment inside the ship was a sensory nightmare. The air was a thick, black soup of carbon and toxic chemical vapors that defeated the strongest flashlights. The sound was a deafening combination of the fire's roar, the screaming of ruptured steam lines, and the rhythmic, metallic banging of the ship's hull as it worked against the 2-meter swells of the Persian Gulf. Every surface was either slick with oily water or hot enough to melt the rubber soles of a sailor's boots. The smell was a nauseating mixture of burnt insulation, vaporized hydraulic fluid, and the sharp, copper tang of blood from the initial casualties. Damage Control Party 17, led by Lieutenant Junior Grade Sarah Jenkins, arrived at the edge of the fire zone at frame 120. They were equipped with the Navy's standard firefighting ensemble heavy gold-coated flash hoods, breathing apparatus, and thick, multi-layered suits designed to withstand extreme thermal energy. Under the flickering red emergency lights, the team looked like spectral figures moving through a landscape of smoke and iron. "Activate the AFFF station," Jenkins shouted through her mask, her voice sounding metallic and distant. The aqueous film-forming foam, known as AFFF, was the only weapon capable of smothering a fuel fire of this magnitude. When the valves were opened, a concentrated chemical soap mixed with seawater was pumped through the hoses, emerging as a thick, white blanket of suds. The sailors leaned into the pressure of the hoses, the kickback of the water at 100 pounds per square inch, nearly throwing them off their feet as the ship's list increased to 10 degrees. The white foam hissed and boiled as it hit the burning JP-5 fuel, creating clouds of blinding white steam that filled the compartment. The temperature dropped slightly, but the danger remained extreme. The fire was re-flashing, the intense heat of the surrounding steel igniting the fuel. Again, the moment the foam blanket was thinned by the motion of the ship. Every time the USS Kearsarge rolled to the starboard side, the burning fuel surged toward the sailors, a literal tide of fire that forced them to retreat 2 paces before pushing forward again. In the engineering control center, the situation was reaching a critical threshold. The list of 10 degrees was beginning to affect the lubrication systems of the main steam turbines. If the ship tilted any further, the massive brass bearings would seize, stripping the USS Kearsarge of its ability to generate power for the pumps and the fire main system. The engineering officer of the watch reported that the secondary drainage pumps were operating at 110% capacity, but they were barely keeping pace with the 15,000 gallons of water entering through the missile breach every minute. On the flight deck above, the crew was executing a heavy weather tie-down of all remaining aircraft to prevent them from sliding into the sea. The deck was tilted at a steep angle, making every movement a calculated risk. Marines and sailors worked in teams of 4, hauling heavy steel chains across the rain-slicked non-skid surface, their faces etched with the exhaustion of 90 minutes of continuous high-stress labor. One AV-8 Bravo Harrier jet, its landing gear damaged by the initial shockwave, began to pivot toward the edge of the deck. 12 men threw their weight against the fuselage, bracing themselves against the wind and the slant of the ship, fighting to secure the multi-million-dollar aircraft before it could plunge into the black water below. By 6 in the morning, the AFFF blanket had finally gained the upper hand on the primary fuel fire. The roar of the flames subsided into a series of small, sputtering pops, leaving behind a dripping, blackened tomb of melted wires and warped steel. However, the victory was hollow. The firefighting efforts had added another 50 tons of water to the starboard side, and the list was now measured at 11 degrees. The USS Kearsarge was no longer a functioning warship. It was a wounded giant, its systems failing one by one as the Persian Gulf claimed more of its interior volume. The crew had held the line against the fire, but the structural integrity of the ship was failing. Deep in the darkness of the lower decks, a primary support stanchion buckled with a sound like a thunderclap, signaling that the weight of the water was now greater than the steel could bear. 6:15 in the morning. Naval support activity. Bahrain, the headquarters of the United States Fifth Fleet. Inside the windowless, high-security vault of the Maritime Operations Center, the atmosphere was one of clinical, cold intensity. The massive digital displays that spanned the front wall were dominated by a real-time tactical map of the Persian Gulf. At the center of the display, a blinking red icon marked the position of the USS Kearsarge, surrounded by the blue symbols of its escorts. To the north, along the jagged coastline of Iran, several amber icons represented the mobile missile batteries that had just attempted to sink an 84,000-ton American warship. Vice Admiral Thomas Vance, the commander of United States Naval Forces Central Command, stood at the center of the room with his arms crossed. He was flanked by his operations officer and the intelligence chief, both of whom were reviewing the latest high-resolution imagery provided by an RQ-4 Global Hawk drone orbiting at 60,000 feet. The admiral was not interested in rhetoric. He was interested in the systematic destruction of the threat that had paralyzed his strike group. The Kearsarge is listing at 11 degrees and losing buoyancy in the well deck, the operations officer reported, his voice echoing in the quiet room. The USS Mason has exhausted 60% of its short-range interceptors. If they launch another wave, we cannot guarantee the safety of the remaining 2,000 personnel on board the LHD. Admiral Vance turned to the communications console. Get me the National Military Command Center. Tell them we are transitioning to Operation Final Guardian. I am requesting immediate authorization to neutralize all active radar and mobile missile sites within 40 miles of the Kearsarge's current position. The authorization arrived in less than 3 minutes, transmitted via secure satellite link from Washington. The rules of engagement had shifted from defensive posture to active suppression of enemy air defenses. At 6:22 in the morning, the order was flashed to Carrier Strike Group 12, centered around the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford, which was positioned 100 miles to the south in the Gulf of Oman. On the flight deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the silence of the dawn was shattered by the roar of General Electric 414 engines. 2 strike fighter squadrons, VFA-31 and VFA-87, were already on Alert 5 status. 12 FA-18 Gulf Growlers and FA-18 Super Hornets were moved onto the 4 electromagnetic catapults. The air above the flight deck shimmered with the heat of the exhaust, smelling of burnt kerosene, and the ozone of the high-energy radar systems. Launch the Alert Birds. The carrier's air boss commanded over the primary flight control circuit. With a sequence of rhythmic, metallic clacks, the catapults fired. The FA-18 fighters were accelerated from 0 to 250 kilometers per hour in less than 3 seconds, their afterburners carving twin tunnels of white-hot fire into the morning mist. As they climbed to 20,000 feet, they were joined by an E-2 Charlie Hawkeye, which began feeding target telemetry directly into the pilot's helmet-mounted displays. The primary targets were the mobile launchers located at coordinates 25 degrees 55 minutes north, 57 degrees 10 minutes east, near the port of Jask. These units were equipped with the active radar systems used to guide the CAT-02 missiles. To ensure total destruction, Admiral Vance also authorized the launch of 16 Tomahawk cruise missiles from the vertical launch cells of the cruiser, CG-73, which was trailing the carrier group. The Tomahawks, designated BGM-109, cleared their launch tubes in a spectacular display of white smoke and orange flame. These missiles, powered by small turbofan engines, dropped to an altitude of only 30 meters, following the contours of the coastline to avoid detection by Iranian ground-based radar. Their mission was to strike the command and control bunkers where the launch orders had originated. Back on the USS Kearsarge, the crew heard the distant, low-frequency rumble of the departing strike. It was the sound of the United States Navy's hammer being pulled back. The sailors in the damage control parties, still waist-deep in oily water, looked at each other with a grim sense of relief. The era of absorbing hits was over. The counterstrike was in motion, a coordinated symphony of precision-guided munitions and electronic warfare designed to erase the Iranian coastal threat from the map. Admiral Vance watched the blue icons of the FA-18 fighters cross the coastline on his display. Time to impact for the first wave is 4 minutes, the intelligence officer noted. The admiral nodded once, his eyes fixed on the screen. The professional machinery of the Fifth Fleet was now fully engaged, and the cost of the strike on the Kearsarge was about to be collected in full. 6:31 in the morning. The coastal cliffs near Jask, Iran. The FA-18 Super Hornets from VFA-31 reached their designated release point 20 miles off the Iranian coastline. The lead pilot, call sign Maverick 1, verified the GPS coordinates on his digital display. 25 degrees 55 minutes north, 57 degrees 10 minutes east. Below the clouds, the Iranian mobile missile battery was attempting to reposition after its initial launch, unaware that the electronic eyes of an orbiting E-2 Charlie Hawkeye were tracking every move of the heavy transport vehicles. The air at 20,000 feet was freezing and thin, a sharp contrast to the humid, smoke-filled chaos on the deck of the USS Kearsarge 50 miles away. The trigger was squeezed on the control stick of the lead Super Hornet. 2 AGM-88 HARM missiles shrieked off the underwing rails, a white column of fire punching backward through the cold morning air as the rocket motors ignited. The heat blast from the launch washed across the fuselage of the aircraft, vibrating the cockpit with a low-frequency roar that the pilot felt in his teeth. The missiles accelerated instantly to Mach 2. Their seeker heads locked onto the specific radar frequency of the Iranian mobile search unit. Simultaneously, 12 GBU-38 Joint Direct Attack munitions were released from the following aircraft, falling in a silent, coordinated arc toward the coordinates of the launch vehicles. The first AGM-88 HARM missile punched straight through the center of the parabolic radar antenna, the hardened nose cone traveling at 2,000 kilometers per hour before the high-explosive fragmentation warhead detonated. The blast shredded the radar van and the 3 personnel inside, sending thousands of pieces of jagged steel through the thin aluminum skin of the vehicle. Seconds later, a 500-pound GBU-38 JDAM slammed into the primary CAT-02 launcher vehicle. The warhead erupted into a localized sun of orange and white fire that vaporized the heavy truck and ignited the 3 remaining cruise missiles stored on its rails. The resulting secondary explosion was massive, a pillar of black smoke and burning propellant that rose 300 meters into the air visible to the sailors on the USS Mason miles out at sea. The Iranian battery crews scrambled in a panic, abandoning their remaining vehicles as the sky above them began to rain steel and fire. One commander attempted to drive a command and control van into a nearby reinforced concrete bunker, his tires spinning in the loose sand. But the American strike was systematic and relentless. A Tomahawk cruise missile, which had been skimming the wavetops for the last 10 minutes, executed its terminal pop-up maneuver. It drove into the heavy steel doors of the bunker at 600 kilometers per hour, the 1,000-pound warhead detonating deep within the structure. The blast wave flattened the surrounding trees and threw a 10-ton transport vehicle 30 meters across the clearing, leaving a crater 6 meters deep, where the command post had stood. A heavy, dead silence fell over the Iranian coastal position, broken only by the crackle of burning electronics and the hiss of escaping steam from destroyed engines. The radar signals that had been painting the USS Kearsarge for the last 2 hours vanished from the screens of the strike group, replaced by the steady, unblinking icons of a neutralized threat. On the horizon, the only movement was the retreating twin trails of the Super Hornets as they climbed back to altitude, their mission of suppression complete. The Iranian battery had been obliterated in less than 90 seconds of coordinated violence, leaving nothing behind but charred craters and the drifting smell of burnt rubber and high explosives. Back at the Maritime Operations Center in Bahrain, the intelligence officer reported the successful strike to Vice Admiral Vance. Targets Alpha through Echo neutralized. We have confirmed secondary explosions at the primary launch site. The radar threat is gone. The Admiral did not celebrate. He simply turned his attention back to the icon of the USS Kearsarge. The threat from the coast had been silenced, but the amphibious ship was still listing at 11 degrees, and the most dangerous phase of the morning, the struggle to keep 84,000 tons of steel above the water, was reaching its breaking point. The professional machinery of the U.S. Navy had delivered its response with surgical precision, but the cost was still being tallied. On the flight deck of the Kearsarge, the crew watched the distant smoke on the horizon with grim satisfaction, even as they prepared for the possibility of an order to abandon ship. The hammer had fallen, but the ship was still bleeding. 7:30 in the morning. The Persian Gulf, 60 miles south of the Iranian coast. The internal condition of the USS Kearsarge reached a critical threshold as the sun began to rise over the horizon. The amphibious assault ship, designated LHD-3, was now listing at 13 degrees to the starboard side. This angle was no longer a manageable tactical challenge. It was a physical threat to the structural integrity of the entire 844-foot hull. The weight of the seawater, estimated at over 20,000 tons, had filled the lower vehicle decks and was now exerting a pressure of thousands of pounds per square inch against the primary transverse bulkheads at frame 115. The environment inside the lower decks had become a landscape of shadows and freezing, oily water. The red emergency lighting was reflected in the black surface of the flood, which had risen to chest height in the narrow passageways. The air was a thick, suffocating mist of salt spray and the lingering, metallic smell of the earlier fire. The ship was no longer humming with the vibrant energy of a warship. Instead, it emitted a series of deep, resonant groans as the steel frames twisted under the uneven weight. These sounds, like the crack of a whip amplified 1,000 times, signaled that the internal supports were reaching their yield point. In the damage control center, the ship's commanding officer, Captain James Sterling, stood braced against the steeply slanted deck. He was reviewing the latest structural analysis provided by the chief engineer. The report was grim. The main longitudinal girder, the backbone of the ship, was showing signs of stress-induced fatigue near the site of the missile impact. If the list reached 15 degrees, the ship's center of gravity would shift beyond the point of recovery, leading to a rapid and catastrophic capsize. "We cannot win the fight against the water if the bulkheads don't hold," the chief engineer stated, his face pale under the grime of 4 hours of continuous labor. The secondary drainage system is completely submerged, and the Pone 100 pumps are being clogged by debris from the vehicle deck. Captain Sterling looked out the bridge windows at the surrounding escorts. The USS Mason and the cruiser CG-73 were holding their positions, their Aegis radar systems still scanning for threats, but they looked small against the backdrop of the listing 84,000-ton giant. The decision was not a matter of courage, but of the cold, professional calculation of human life against a piece of steel that was already dying. Initiate a controlled evacuation of all non-essential personnel, Captain Sterling ordered, his voice echoing clearly over the bridge speakers. I want the 24th Marine Expeditionary Unit moved to the flight deck for immediate transfer to the surface escorts. Damage control teams and essential bridge crew will remain to attempt a final shoring of the bulkheads. The order for a controlled evacuation was executed with the disciplined precision that defines the United States Navy. There was no panic. Instead, over 1,500 Marines and sailors began an orderly ascent from the lower berthing areas and hangar decks. They moved in single-file lines up the steeply angled ladders, their boots clattering on the steel steps. Many carried their individual gear and weapons, their faces set in grim expressions of professional focus. The smell of the sea air on the flight deck was a sharp relief from the toxic atmosphere below. But it was tempered by the sight of the deck's edge dipping dangerously close to the whitecaps of the Persian Gulf. On the flight deck, the air was filled with the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors. MH-60, Sierra helicopters from the USS Gerald R. Ford, and the surrounding strike group began a continuous relay. Each aircraft landed on the slanted non-skid surface for only 60 seconds, boarding 20 personnel before lifting off again to ferry them to the safety of the nearby destroyers. The coordination was a masterpiece of logistics, managed by deck officers who used hand signals and colored vests to direct the flow of hundreds of people in the midst of a sinking ship's final hours. Below the flight deck, the remaining damage control teams were making a final, desperate stand. They were using heavy timber shores, thick beams of Douglas fir to brace the failing bulkhead at frame 115. The sound of sledgehammers striking steel echoed through the flooded compartments as the sailors wedged the wood into place. Every time the ship rolled, the timbers groaned under the weight of the ocean pressing against the other side. The water was cold, slick with diesel fuel, and vibrating with the low-frequency hum of the remaining emergency generators. Despite their efforts, the list increased to 14 degrees at 8:15 in the morning. The USS Kearsarge was beginning to lose its buoyancy in the stern, and the sea began to wash over the edge of the well-decked door. The professional resolve of the crew remained unbroken, but the physics of the situation were becoming absolute. The ship was no longer a platform for power projection. It was a vessel in its final moments of life, and the focus of the Fifth Fleet was now entirely on the survival of its crew. 8:30 in the morning. The Persian Gulf, 65 miles from the coast of Iran. The search and rescue operation for the 2,400 personnel aboard the USS Kearsarge had transitioned into a high-speed logistical marathon. While the ship's list reached 15 degrees, the surrounding strike group moved into a tight defensive circle, creating a lily-pad network of flight decks to ferry the crew to safety. The destroyer USS Mason and the cruiser CG-73 were positioned only 500 meters from the wounded giant, their side ports open and their rescue swimmers already in the water to assist those who were forced to descend the pilot ladders. The environment was one of controlled, high-stakes urgency. The morning sun was now fully up, casting a harsh, flat light over the choppy gray-green water of the Gulf. The air was filled with a constant, overlapping roar from the engines of 12 MH-60 Sierra helicopters that were circling the Kearsarge like a swarm of protective insects. The smell of the sea was now entirely masked by a thick, heavy blanket of diesel exhaust and the acrid stench of the chemical foam used to fight the earlier fires. The coordination of the rescue was managed by the Sea Combat Commander aboard the USS Mason. Using secure tactical data links, the controllers tracked every individual being moved. On the flight deck of the Kearsarge, the Marines of the 24th Marine Expeditionary Unit were being loaded into helicopters in groups of 20. The sailors and Marines stood in disciplined rows, their life jackets inflated and their helmets secured, waiting for the signal to sprint toward the waiting rotors. Each helicopter remained on the deck for less than 45 seconds, the pilots fighting the steep 15-degree incline and the unpredictable gusts of wind that whipped across the non-skid surface. By 8:45, over 1,200 personnel had been successfully transferred to the surrounding vessels. The USS Gerald R. Ford, positioned 20 miles to the south, had cleared its entire hangar deck to serve as a massive medical triage and reception center. As the helicopters landed on the carrier's 4.5-acre flight deck, teams of medical corpsmen moved in to assist the wounded. The casualties from the initial missile strike, including the 6 severely injured Marines from the well deck, were immediately rushed to the carrier's advanced surgical suites. The professional efficiency of the medical staff ensured that even in the chaos of a sinking ship, every sailor received the highest level of care. Within minutes of leaving the Kearsarge, however, deep inside the hull of the USS Kearsarge, the situation had finally moved beyond the reach of human effort. At frame 115, the primary transverse bulkhead, the massive steel wall, designed to keep the ship's internal compartments separate, began to fail. The sounds coming from the darkness were no longer groans. They were the sharp, metallic reports of grade A steel bolts shearing under the weight of 20,000 tons of water. Each snap sounded like a gunshot, echoing through the flooded passageways and sending tremors through the deck plates. Lieutenant Junior Grade Sarah Jenkins and her damage control team were the last personnel in the vicinity of the breach. They were attempting to secure a final set of steel shoring beams when the bulkhead buckled. A vertical crack, 3 meters long, opened in the center of the steel plate. A jet of high-pressure seawater hissed through the opening with enough force to cut through a human limb. "Everyone out! Abandon the compartment! Move! Move! Move!" Jenkins shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the incoming ocean. The team scrambled up the vertical ladders, their hands slipping on the oily rungs. They reached the hangar deck just as the secondary watertight doors were sealed behind them by the automated hydraulic system. It was the final defensive act for the interior of the ship. With the failure of the primary bulkhead, the flooding was no longer confined to the vehicle decks. The water was now surging into the secondary machinery rooms and the lower ammunition magazines. The list of the USS Kearsarge increased rapidly, moving from 15 degrees to 18 degrees in less than 10 minutes. On the bridge, Captain Sterling received the final report from the Damage Control Center. The ship was losing the bubble, a naval term for the point where a vessel can no longer maintain its stability. The center of gravity had shifted too far to the starboard side. The 84,000-ton ship was now leaning so far that the waves were beginning to wash over the starboard flight deck elevator. "All remaining personnel, this is the captain." Sterling's voice broadcasted over the ship's general announcing system, powered by the last remaining emergency battery bank. "Abandon ship. I repeat, abandon ship. All hands to the life rafts on the port side. Godspeed." The final 300 sailors, including the bridge crew and the damage control parties, began their descent. They used the high side of the ship, the port side, which was now rising high out of the water like the side of a gray mountain. They slid down long, orange inflatable chutes, or climbed down cargo nets into the waiting life rafts. The USS Kearsarge was now a ghost ship, silent and empty, save for the sound of the water claiming its interior. The professional discipline of the crew had ensured that every living soul was off the ship before the sea took its final prize. 9:15 in the morning. The USS Kearsarge was no longer a vessel of the United States Navy. It was a dying monument of steel, alone in its final moments. The amphibious assault ship, designated LHD-3, had reached a list of 35 degrees to the starboard side. The massive flight deck, once a platform for the most advanced aircraft in the world, was now a steep, slick cliff of non-skid coating and salt spray. The waves of the Persian Gulf were no longer hitting the hull. They were washing over the starboard elevator and pouring into the hangar deck in one, a series of rhythmic, white-capped surges. From a distance of 1,000 meters, the crews of the USS Mason and The cruiser CG-73 watched in a heavy, professional silence. There were no cheers and no radio chatter, only the sound of the wind and the low-frequency groan of a ship being torn apart by the weight of the ocean. The physical sinking of an 84,000-ton warship is a violent, sensory event. As the stern of the USS Kearsarge began to settle deeper into the water, the air trapped within the forward compartments was compressed to the point of explosion. A series of massive air pockets erupted from the port side of the hull, sending geysers of white foam and black oil 20 meters into the sky. The sound was like a sequence of heavy artillery rounds being fired in rapid succession, a deep, concussive thrum that vibrated through the hulls of the nearby escort ships. The environment around the ship was a chaotic vortex. The air smelled of heavy fuel oil, burnt, insulation, and the sharp, clean scent of the open sea. As the ship's center of gravity finally failed, the USS Kearsarge executed a slow, agonizing roll. The 4.5-acre flight deck tilted toward the vertical, and the deck, remaining heavy equipment, including several damaged MH-60 Sierra helicopters and a row of firefighting tractors, snapped their final steel tethers. They tumbled across the deck and plunged into the churning water with massive splashes, disappearing instantly into the darkness. At coordinates 26 degrees 38 minutes north, 55 degrees 18 minutes east, the USS Kearsarge took its final plunge. The stern went under first, the massive bronze propellers rising high into the morning light for a single, fleeting moment before being dragged down by the weight of the flooded well deck. The bow followed, the giant numbers, 3 painted on the hull disappearing beneath a massive white swell. An enormous whirlpool formed over the site. A swirling circle of white water and debris that sucked in anything remaining on the surface. Within 60 seconds, horizon was empty of the ship's silhouette. The aftermath on the surface was a grim mosaic of the ship's life. A massive slick of JP-5 aviation fuel and diesel oil spread across 2 miles of the Gulf, smoothing the tops of the waves into a shimmering, iridescent sheet. Thousands of pieces of debris, life jackets, flight, deck helmets, wooden shoring beams, and loose paperwork bobbed in the oily wake. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant, receding whine of the helicopters carrying the last of the survivors to the USS Gerald R. Ford. The commander of the USS Mason did not allow the moment of loss to linger. The professional requirements of the mission dictated an immediate tactical repositioning. All engines ahead flank. The order came. Across the bridge. Reposition to Sector Delta. We are establishing a 5-mile exclusion zone around the debris field. The destroyer pivoted sharply to the south, its hull cutting through the oil-slicked water at 35 knots. The cruiser CG-73 followed, its Aegis radar system still operating at maximum power. The loss of the Kearsarge was a strategic blow, but the strike group was now transitioning to a more aggressive, offensive posture. The 5th Fleet was no longer in a rescue mode. It was in a state of active maritime dominance, 100 miles. To the south, the USS Gerald R. Ford began to turn into the wind. The carrier's deck was a beehive of activity as fresh squadrons of FA-18 Super Hornets were fueled and armed with long-range anti-ship missiles. The sinking of the Kearsarge had settled the question of intent. The United States Navy was now moving to clear the Persian Gulf of all hostile surface threats. The morning sun was high in the sky, reflecting off the oil-slicked graveyard of the Kearsarge as the first wave of the carrier's retaliatory strike roared off the Kearsarge catapults and headed north. 12 noon on the 14th of January, 2026. The Persian Gulf, 60 miles south of the Iranian coastline. The surface of the sea, at coordinates 26 degrees 38 minutes north, 55 degrees 18 minutes east, was a flat, glassy expanse, broken only by the shimmering rainbow of a 5-mile oil slick and a scattered field of white debris. Carrier Strike Group 12, led by the USS Gerald R. Ford, maintained a protective screen around the site where the USS Kearsarge had disappeared beneath the waves exactly 3 hours earlier. The air was heavy with the smell of ozone from the carrier's continuous radar sweeps and the faint, lingering scent of burnt jet fuel that drifted over the water. The immediate tactical assessment was conducted with the clinical precision of a professional military organization. The 5th Fleet Commander, Vice Admiral Thomas Vance, reviewed the final after-action report from the secure briefing room of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The sinking of the 84,000-ton amphibious assault ship was a significant strategic loss, but the professional conduct of the crew had prevented a humanitarian catastrophe. The final casualty report for the engagement was read aloud in the quiet room. 14 United States sailors and Marines were confirmed killed in action, most having been lost in the initial missile impact and the subsequent fire in the lower vehicle decks. 82 personnel were wounded, with 12 in critical condition being treated in the advanced medical suites of the carrier. Of the 2,400 personnel who had been aboard the USS Kearsarge when the first Tate-02 missile struck, over 99% had been successfully evacuated to the surrounding surface escorts. On the other side of the ledger, the Iranian coastal threat had been systematically neutralized. The retaliatory strikes by the F/A-18 Super Hornets and Tomahawk cruise missiles had destroyed 3 mobile missile batteries, 1 regional command and control bunker, and 2 coastal radar installations. Intelligence estimates suggested that 42 Iranian personnel were neutralized during the suppression of the batteries. The specific radar signature of the Tate-02 system had been removed from the sector, ensuring that no further surprise attacks could be launched against the remaining vessels of the strike group. The tactical lessons learned from the sinking of the USS Kearsarge LHD-3 were already being transmitted to the Naval Surface Warfare Center. The primary vulnerability had been the proximity of the JP-5 fuel lines to the lower vehicle decks and the structural stress caused by the rapid flooding of the well deck. Future damage control protocols for Wasp-class and America-class ships would be updated to include enhanced shoring techniques for primary transverse bulkheads under high-pressure flooding. Strategically, the United States Navy responded by increasing its presence in the region. 2 additional Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, the DDG-87 and the DDG-95, were ordered to transit the Strait of Hormuz to reinforce the carrier strike group. The loss of the Kearsarge did not lead to a withdrawal. Instead, it solidified the American commitment to maintaining freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf. As the sun began to set on the day of the battle, a brief memorial service was held on the flight deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The crew stood in silent ranks, their shadows long against the non-skid surface. A single bugler played taps as a wreath was committed to the deep, drifting slowly toward the spot where the Kearsarge now rested on the seabed 120 meters below. The professional machinery of the United States Navy continued to turn. Radars spun, flight decks remained active, and the search for secondary threats continued without pause. The USS Kearsarge was gone, but the sailors who had fought to save her were already being reassigned to other units, their discipline and resilience serving as the foundation for the next watch. The Persian Gulf was quiet, once again, but it was the quiet of a force that had been tested and had held its ground.